And his great-grandfather, Joseph Lovecraft Jr., immigrated from Devon, England. Unfortunately, Lovecraft's father became acutely psychotic in 1893 when Lovecraft was 3 and was placed in the Providence Psychiatric Institution of Butler Hospital. Yeah, that must have been a terrifying place. He remained there until his death in 1898. And Lovecraft maintained throughout his life that his father died in a condition of paralysis brought on by nervous exhaustion. It has been suggested his father's mental illness may have been caused by syphilis, but neither Lovecraft nor his mother also died in Butler Hospital, seems to have shown signs of the disease. So after his dad was put in the hospital, Lovecraft was raised by his mother and his aunts and his grandfather, who was an American businessman, and all 5 lived together in the family home. Lovecraft was a prodigy. He recited poetry at the age of 3 and writing complete poems by the age of 6. His grandfather encouraged his reading, providing him with classics such as 1001 Nights, Thomas Bulfinch's Age of Fable, and children's version of the Iliad and the Odyssey. His grandfather also stirred the boy's interest in the weird by telling him his own original tales of Gothic horror, which was cool. At least he had some support. Poor Poe had none. He had none. So at least his grandfather was willing to support him. He was frequently ill as a child and barely attended school until he was 8 because of his sickly condition, and became withdrawn after a year. He read voraciously and became especially enamored of chemistry and astronomy. He produced several hectographic publications with a limited circulation, beginning in 1899 with the Scientific Gazette. 4 years later, he returned to public school. Early in his life, Lovecraft is believed to have suffered from sleep paralysis, a form of parasomnia. He believed himself to be assaulted at night by horrific night gaunts, and much of his later work is thought to have been directly inspired by these night terrors. I believe they call them night terrors now. Isn't that the correct term now? Night terrors? Indeed, night gaunts became the subject of a poem of the same name. They were personified as devil-like creatures without faces. And his grandfather's death in 1904 greatly affected his life. Mismanagement of his estate left his family in a poor financial state, and they were forced to move into smaller accommodations, a duplex. He is said to have suffered in 1908, prior to his high school graduation, that what he later described as a nervous breakdown, and he never received his high school diploma. S.T. Joshi suggests in his biography of Lovecraft that a primary cause for this breakdown was his difficulty in higher mathematics, a subject he needed to master to become a professional astronomer. Poor Lovecraft was gaunt with dark eyes set in a very pale face. He rarely went out before nightfall. For 5 years after leaving school, he lived an isolated existence without his mother, primarily writing poetry without seeking employment or social contact. In 1913, this changed when he wrote a letter to the pulp magazine Argosy, complaining about the insipidness of the love stories in the publication. The debate in the magazine's letters column caught the eye of Edward Doss, president of the United Amateur Press Association, who invited Lovecraft to join the organization. Lovecraft tried to join the National Guard, but he couldn't pass the physical. Okay. The United Amateur Press Association reinvigorated Lovecraft and incited him to contribute many poems and essays. In 1916, his first published story, The Alchemist, appeared. The earliest commercially published work came in 1922 when he was 31. By this time, he had begun to build what became a huge network of correspondence. His lengthy and frequent missives would make him one of the great letter writers of the century. Among his correspondents were Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, the Conan Barbarian series. Many former aspiring authors later paid tribute to his mentoring and encouragement through the correspondence. He's sometimes seen as consisting of three periods: an early Edgar Allan Poe influence, followed by a Lord Dunsany-inspired dream cycle, and finally the Cthulhu mythos stories. Many distinctive ideas and entities present in the third period were introduced in earlier works, such as Dagon, and the threefold classification is partly overlapping. In 1919, after suffering from hysteria and depression, Lovecraft's mother was committed to Butler Hospital. And it's the same mental institution where her husband died. Nevertheless, she wrote frequent letters to Lovecraft, and they remained close until her death in 1921. Supposedly, the result of complications from gallbladder surgery. That's kind of scary because I had that done. Had I known that, maybe not. I don't know. Of course, don't forget that was a mental institution. That's kind of scary they were doing that. I don't know. Who knows what went on in those places. They were pretty scary and terrifying back then. And a few days after his mom's death, Lovecraft attended a convention of amateur journalists in Boston. He met and became friends with Sonia Green, a widow and owner of a successful hat shop, and 7 years older. Lovecraft's aunts disapproved of the relationship, but him and Green married in 1924 and relocated to her Brooklyn apartment at Flatbush Avenue. Flatbush. That's a name I know. She thought he needed to get out of Providence to flourish and was willing to support him financially. Green, who had been married before, later said Lovecraft had performed satisfactorily, though she had to take the initiative in all aspects of the relationship. Lovecraft's weight increased to 200 pounds on his wife's home cooking. Whoa! Must have been good. He was enthralled by New York and in what was informally dubbed the Calum Club. He acquired a group of encouraging intellectual and literary friends who urged him to submit stories to Weird Tales, which we all know about. Weird Tales, I think we all know about that. And the editor accepted many otherworldly dream cycle Lovecraft stories for the publication, although they were heavily criticized by a section of the readership. What a surprise. Again, you have that stuffy aristocratic side that puts their nose down to you. Established informally some years before, Lovecraft lived in New York. The core of Calum Club members were boys adventure novelist Henry Everett McNeill, the lawyer and anarchist writer James Ferdinand Morton Jr., and the poet Reinhard Kleiner. On New Year's Day of 1925, Sonia moved to Cleveland for a job opportunity. Oh, what the heck there, huh? Who knew? I'm from around there. And Lovecraft left Flatbush for a first-floor apartment on Clinton Street at the edge of Red Hook. And it's a location which became to discomfort him greatly. Later that year, Calum Club's 4 regular attendees were joined by Lovecraft along with his protege Frank Belknap Long, bookseller George Willard Kirk, and Lovecraft's close friend Samuel Loveman. Loveman was Jewish but was unaware of Lovecraft's attitudes. Conversely, it has been suggested that Lovecraft disliked mention of sexual matters and was unaware that Loverman and some of his other friends were homosexual. Oh, that was a taboo back then, do you think? Of course he was probably unaware. No, that was not talked about. But anyway, long after the marriage, Green lost her business and her assets disappeared in a bank failure. She became ill. Lovecraft made efforts to support his wife through regular jobs, but because of lack of previous work experience, he lacked proven marketable skills again. So, As a few unsuccessful attempts as a low-level clerk, his job-seeking became desultory. The publisher Weird Tales attempted to put the loss-making magazine on a business footing and offered the job of editor to Lovecraft, who declined. Who thought? He was reluctant to relocate to Chicago. Think of the tragedy of such a move for an aged antiquarian, a 34-year-old writer declared. Baird was replaced with Farnsworth Wright, whose writing Lovecraft had criticized. And, of course, Lovecraft's submissions were often rejected. In the aftermath of Weird Tales, there were censorship guidelines, of course. There was a big censorship thing, going on back then. And now, especially after an aftermath of a story that hinted at necrophilia. Hinted, mind you. So they were pretty strict. Although after Lovecraft's death, Wright accepted many of the stories he had originally rejected. What a surprise. He thought he'd become popular for doing that. Let's see. I just want to go through this. We don't need to know all that. Green, moving where the work was, relocated to Cincinnati and then to Cleveland because her employment required constant travel. Lovecraft's single-room apartment, not far from the working-class waterfront, was burglared, leaving him with the only clothes he was wearing. In August 1925, he wrote The Horror at Red Hook, and he, in the latter of which the narrator says, "My coming to New York had been a mistake, for whereas I had looked for poignant wonder and inspiration, I had found instead only a sense of horror and oppression, which threatened to master, paralyze, and annihilate me." And around this time, he wrote the outline for the Kalachuchlu, with its theme of the insignificance of all humanity. In the bibliographical study, H.P. Lovecraft Against the World, Against Life, the author suggested that the misfortunes fed Lovecraft's central motivation as a writer, which he said was racial resentment. Okay, I doubt that. I don't think so. What do you think, Chris? You think Lovecraft had racial resentment? Personally, I don't, but you might. He got a weekly allowance from Green. He moved to a working-class area of Brooklyn Heights, where he attained an apartment. And then he moved back to Providence. He lived in a spacious Victorian wooden house. The same address is given as the home of Dr. Willett in Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. The period beginning after his return to Providence, the last decade of his life, was his most prolific. He produced short stories as well as his longest work of fiction, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and At the Mountains of Madness. Yeah, I don't think so either. I don't think it was racial resentment at the time. I don't know. I don't think he did. It's just the misfortunes. I mean, look at this. You can see the similarities between him and Poe at this point. But anyway, it's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward and At the Mountains of Madness. He frequently revised work for other authors and did a large amount of ghostwriting. I didn't know that, including The Mound, Winged Death, and The Diary of Alonzo Typer. Client Harry Houdini was laudatory, and he attempted to help Lovecraft by introducing him to the head of a newspaper syndicate. So that was pretty cool. Plans for a future project were ended, of course, by Houdini's death. Maybe at the time, maybe they, I don't know. I just think it was just people in general. Yeah, I agree, Chris. Not any worse than any of the others. I just think he was disappointed in humans, period. I mean, look what happened to him. So, although he was able to combine his distinctive style with the kind of stock content action that the editor of Weird Tales